Welcome Year 11 and well done for tuning in to a little bit of homework help. Obviously it's changed this term. We're looking at paper 2, which is hugely different from the Germany and medicine that's covered in paper 1, so it's really important we get a grasp of working with sources, something which I think most of us have got quite familiar with in papers 1, but since this is a solely source based paper, that could be tricky, so it's really important, as I said, that we tune into these videos. Week 1 homework is looking at how useful a source is, okay, and that could appear in any sort of order. It could appear in the third question, the fourth question, it does not matter. The only one that will be slightly dissimilar, I'd have thought, is the last one, really. The last one that asks you to make some sort of judgment and it's some sort of statement. So week 1 homework is looking at the utility, how useful is this source as evidence about public health in the first half of the 19th century. So there's a few obviously things that you should be thinking about straight away. The obvious one is that public health, that we're quite familiar with, I hope, is not particularly good in the 19th century, particularly the early part of it. So we know that there's a lot of back-to-back housing, sewage is essentially emptied into the streets, sanitary provisions in terms of toilets doesn't really exist. There's not much call for taxes to pay for any of these improvements because of a laissez-faire attitude that existed for many years. So we know that things aren't great in that sense, okay? And it says use the source and your own knowledge to help. Now that's quite important in as far as you have to use details from the source and you have to tell us what you know about public health in the first half of the 19th century. Now the easiest way to do utility questions is straightforward. You tell us what's useful and what's not. Alright? It is that simple. But obviously there's a bit more to it than just not useful and useful. You've got to explain why certain things are useful and why they aren't. Okay? Now you can say it out like that if you like, that's absolutely fine. So think about the actual source itself, what's useful, what does it tell us, what does it show us about conditions in 19th century, why isn't it useful, who's wrote it, why might that endanger it as a source, why might that compromise it, okay, why might that make it slightly biased. So they're the things that you're going to focus on. That brings us on to the source, really. So the source is quite straightforward. It's written by an MP in 1832, so there's a few things that should hopefully set alarm bells going there, hopefully. We've got the 1832 bit and we've got the fact it's an MP, okay? So both those things quite important, very, very important in fact, in as far as it changes what we know about it. Now 1832, there's a huge cholera outbreak in 1832 and a lot of people are affected by it. So cholera is quite, it's on the radar as such in 1832. Now this speech is by an MP who you'd hope is clued up on the prospect of cholera in London, but as you know, MPs don't tend to live in quite downbeat, poor areas. So there's a good chance that this MP is not looking at the cholera outbreak in a fair perspective, you know. Cholera outbreak in 1832 is probably in its worst at the east end of London. This guy doesn't live anywhere near it. We don't know that for a fact, but there's a good chance that he lives in quite a nice, affluent part of London, okay? And the general gist of the source is that people are over-exaggerating, just how bad the outbreak is. So it would appear that the guy here, for example, says that these doctors said that cholera is not a contagious disease. So he spoke with 73 doctors who've led an inquiry. One of them, who's an expert on the subject, told me that there'd been no unusual increase in the average number of deaths in London for this time of year. So he appears to be saying that it's not that big a deal, and in actual fact people are making a little bit too much of the cholera outbreak. In the meantime, I believe it is a great matter of distress that £20 million worth of property is laying on board ships in harbours because of quarantine. Okay, so he's obviously quite annoyed that a lot of produce and certainly a lot of products that potentially might affect him is going to waste. Okay, so what's useful about it? Well, what does it tell us is big on the agenda in 1832? Dead straightforward. Big on the agenda is cholera. The guy mentions it. He's spoken about it. So we know that cholera is definitely on the radar in 1832. You know from your own knowledge that that's the case, that is a huge problem, okay? What does it tell us about conditions in 1832? Well, not a great deal, to be honest, in as far as the actual source doesn't mention much about conditions. But you could say from your own knowledge that there is a heck of a lot of slum housing, there's a lot of back-to-back housing, that sanitary conditions are fairly poor, that people can't afford healthcare and don't really understand how disease spreads, so they neglect things like that. And remember, germ theory is not invented while 1861. So 1832, if someone proposed that germs are spread by waste, seems a bit of an alien concept, okay? But it is useful for that. Why is it not useful? Well, it's not useful because the guy is obviously an MP, and as we said, he does not live in poor areas. He's not going to live in East End of London where cholera outbreaks are rife. He's not going to live in other poor parts of London, other poor parts of the country. And as we said before, the problem is germ theory is not invented while 1861, so quite a lot of people don't understand this link, particularly MPs who are losing vast amounts of trade in the meantime. Now it's just time for you to have a go at the question. Remember to answer it, what's useful, what's not useful, why is it a bit of a problem, and you must use the source, the details from the source, and your own knowledge. Remember, you've spent 3 years learning about this. It would be an absolute shame to not mention all the fantastic work you've done in the 3 years, and obviously let that go by. Good luck.